Clara Calloway, Duchess of Renwick, did not scream. She did not weep. She did not so much as set her wine-glass down too hard on the stone balustrade, though her fingers wanted to. She set it down softly, with both hands, the way she set down anything she meant to leave behind for good. Below her, in the lantern-lit sweep of the terrace, her husband stood with a woman's gloved hand resting in the crook of his arm, as though it had always belonged there, and the county of Belhurst watched him not correct the impression. Clara touched the small brass key that hung on its faded blue ribbon at her throat, the one thing in the world that was entirely hers, and she thought, with a calm that frightened her more than tears would have, that by morning she would be gone, and it would take the Duke of Renwick the better part of a year to understand what he had just finished losing. The autumn of 1816 had come to Renwick the way it always did, heavy with cut hay, and indifferent to the people beneath it, and if anyone in the county had been asked, 6 months earlier, to describe the Duchess of Renwick, they would have struggled. She was not spoken of the way beauties were spoken of. She was spoken of the way good drainage was spoken of, or a reliable clock, necessary, unremarked, assumed. Clara had married Edmund Calloway, 6th Duke of Renwick, 2 years before, in a ceremony attended by exactly 11 people, and negotiated by solicitors who cared a great deal about her father's linen mills, and nothing at all about whether the bride and groom exchanged a single unscripted word beforehand. They had not. Edmund needed capital and a steady hand on a household that had gone soft with debt under his own father's neglect. Josiah Whitfield, dying of a wasting cough and terrified for his only child's future, needed a title that would keep her safe after he was gone. Both men got what they wanted. Nobody had asked Clara what she wanted, and she had not offered it, because she had already learned, at 19, that wanting things out loud rarely improved your chances of keeping them. She had gone to Renwick Hall a stranger, and made herself indispensable within a season. She untangled the estate's books, which had not balanced in 4 years. She renegotiated grain contracts that had been quietly bleeding the tenantry white. She learned every hedge and drainage ditch on 1,100 acres, walked them in weather that kept the steward indoors, and by the second winter the harvest had recovered enough that the Duke's creditors stopped writing letters with threats folded into their courtesies. Edmund noticed none of it directly. He noticed only that the house ran, that his correspondence was answered, that his mother's old debts no longer arrived at breakfast to ruin his coffee. He thanked her the way a man thanks a good winter, vaguely, and to no one in particular. He was, in all things concerning her, correct. He was never cruel. He was also never, not once in 2 years, warm. And Clara had stopped expecting warmth the way a person stops expecting a letter that has clearly been lost in the post. She filed the wanting away in a drawer of her mind she had built for exactly that purpose, latched it, and went back to the ledgers, which never disappointed her, because she had written every figure in them herself. The evening of the county assembly had begun like any other. Clara had dressed with her usual economy, a gown she had already worn twice that season, because new silk was a debt the estate did not need, and had gone down to the receiving line expecting to stand, as she always stood, a half step behind her husband, greeting neighbours who liked her well enough without quite knowing why they should. What she had not expected was the woman already on his arm when she reached the terrace. Miss Vivienne Sorrel wore green silk that had certainly not been paid for out of Renwick's careful accounts, and she wore it the way some women wear attention itself, as though it had been tailored for her alone. Edmund did not introduce her as anything in particular. He did not need to. The county did the introducing for him, in the low, delighted murmur that moves through a crowded terrace, the way water moves downhill, finding every low place and filling it. By the time Clara understood what she was seeing, half of Belhurst already believed they understood it too, and none of them looked at her with anything so honest as pity. They looked at her the way one looks at furniture that is about to be replaced. She had gone perfectly still. Later, she would not be able to say for how long enough to hear, through the open library door behind her, her husband's cousin Percival Voss speaking to someone she did not trouble to identify, in the unhurried tone of a man who believes himself unheard. "She is suitable," Percival said. And there was something almost admiring in it, the admiration one gives a well-built wall. That is all she has ever needed to be. Edmund did not marry her for anything more than that, and no one ought to pretend otherwise, least of all her. A pause, and then, worse, because it came in Edmund's own voice, flat and unbothered as a man reading a bill of sale. No. Nothing more than that. He had not even lowered his voice to say it. Clara did not go to him. She did not demand an explanation on the terrace, in front of 40 witnesses who would have enjoyed nothing more. She allowed herself precisely 10 minutes. She counted them against the case clock in the hall as she walked past it, because Josiah Whitfield had taught her that grief unmanaged was simply another kind of debt, compounding while you weren't looking. And at the end of the 10 minutes she went upstairs, packed one trunk with her own money, her father's letters, and the small strong-box key she never removed from around her neck, and left Renwick Hall before the last carriages had even quit the drive. She did not slam a single door. Mrs. Hetty Marsh, who had been her father's oldest friend, and who kept a modest inn 2 villages distant at Larkfield, opened her door at midnight to find the Duchess of Renwick standing on the step with a trunk dry-eyed, and said only, "Well, I suppose you'll want the back room. It has the good light for accounts." Clara thought, distinctly, standing in that doorway, "I did not marry for love, and I will not stay for its absence to be paraded before the county like livestock at auction." Her father used to say, "Work honestly, and let the accounts speak for you." She intended to let hers speak very loudly indeed. The old Whitfield mill at Larkfield had stood shuttered for 6 years, ever since Josiah's health had forced him to sell his working interest and retire to the smaller trade of gentleman farmer. It belonged to Clara outright, the one piece of property her marriage settlement had left entirely in her own name. Because her father, no fool about the world, had insisted on it. Hetty thought she had lost her mind when Clara announced, over breakfast the next morning, that she intended to reopen it. "You're a duchess," Hetty said, not unkindly, buttering bread with the brisk economy of a woman who had never had time for nonsense. "Duchesses don't run mills." "This one does," Clara said, "because this duchess has nowhere else that is entirely hers, and a mill that pays wages is worth considerably more to me at present than a title that pays nothing." Hetty studied her for a long moment, the particular stillness of a woman deciding whether to argue with the tide, and then set down the butter knife. "Right then," she said. "I'll want the accounts kept honest. I've buried too many friends who kept them otherwise." "They will be," Clara said, and touched the key at her throat without meaning to. It was the only promise she made that morning, and she meant to keep it the way she kept everything, in writing. She began with the mill race, which had silted badly, and with the ledger her father had left, locked in the old strong box behind the counting-room wall, the box the little brass key opened, containing not treasure but something better, in Clara's estimation, a full and honest record of every debt Josiah Whitfield had ever paid, and every wage he had ever owed, going back 11 years. She hired back 3 of her father's old workers within the week. men who had scattered to lesser mills when Whitfield's closed, and had never been paid what they were promised elsewhere. She posted the wage rate on the mill door, in her own hand, where anyone could read it and hold her to it. Tobias Fenn, 16 and lean as a fence rail, the son of her father's old miller, was the first to appear asking for work, and the first to notice that the new mistress of the mill checked her own sums twice before she paid anyone. Not because she distrusted her workers, but because she distrusted herself with other people's wages. "My father used to do the same," Tobias said, watching her recount a column of figures. "Said a man who guesses at another man's pay isn't fit to employ him." Clara looked up at him properly, for the first time. "Your father," she said, "was a wise man. I intend to be as careful as he was." It was, though she did not know it yet, the first plank of the bridge she would need before the year was out. Word of the mill's reopening reached Renwick Hall within a fortnight, carried, as such things always were, on the tongues of people who had no notion how far their gossip travelled. It was Percival Voss who brought the news to Edmund directly, standing in the estate office with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering bad news he intends to profit from. "Your wife," Percival said, "has taken up trade." In Larkfield. Running her father's old mill like a common tradeswoman. He said it as though he expected the Duke to be embarrassed. Edmund, to his own surprise, was not embarrassed. He was, for the first time in longer than he cared to examine, afraid, and he did not yet understand why, only that the house had gone strangely quiet without the sound of Clara's step in the passage, and that the last quarter's rents, which she had always reconciled without being asked, sat untouched on his desk in a jumble he did not know how to read. The mill's second month brought its first true test, and Clara met it the way she met everything, with a plan written out the night before, in a hand that did not shake. A shipment of milled flour, contracted to the bakeries of Belhurst, had come back short by 11 sacks, and the carter blamed spoilage on the road, while the numbers in his own manifest told a different, quieter story. Clara did not accuse him in front of the men. She asked him, in the counting room, with Hetty Marsh standing arms folded by the door, to walk her through the weighing at each stage of the journey, and she wrote down every figure he gave her as he gave it, and when he reached the third weighing station, his own account of the weight no longer matched the weight he had sworn to at the second. "You've made an error somewhere," she said, mildly, "and I should like to find it with you before I write to the magistrate about it, because I would rather correct an honest mistake than prosecute a dishonest one, and I have not yet decided which this is." The carter's composure did not survive the offer. He returned 9 of the 11 sacks within the week, and did not trouble the Whitfield mill again. Tobias, who had watched the whole exchange from the doorway, told his mother that night that the new Duchess did not raise her voice once, and still frightened a grown man into honesty inside of 20 minutes. The story travelled, as such stories do, the way water moves downhill, finding every low place in the county and filling it, and this time what it filled was not pity, but something closer to respect. Edmund heard that story too, second hand, weeks later, from a neighbour who told it at his own table as an amusing county anecdote, not knowing or caring that the amusement landed on the Duke like a blow. He found himself, that night, standing in the estate office long after the household had gone to bed, staring at a column of figures he could not make balance, and thinking, for the first time in 2 years, about the particular quality of a room that runs itself without a woman being thanked for it. He did not go to Larkfield. He told himself it was pride. It was, in truth, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, in which the answer keeps coming out the same no matter how he shuffles the figures, that the house had been breathing because of her, and now it was holding its breath, and he did not know how to ask it to exhale again. What Edmund did not know, and what Clara had not yet troubled herself to learn either, was that Percival Voss's interest in Miss Vivienne Sorel had never been romantic on anyone's part but the county's imagination. Percival was heir presumptive to Rennick should the marriage be set aside, and he held, tucked into a strong-box of his own at his lodgings in Belhurst, a note purporting to prove that Josiah Whitfield's dowry payment, the £3,000 that had settled Edmund's debts and secured the marriage, had never in fact been paid in full, only promised, with a false receipt forged to close the transaction quietly, while the old man was too ill to correct the record. If the note held, the marriage settlement could be challenged as fraudulent, the union set aside, and Percival's claim to the dukedom restored with Edmund's debts still, conveniently, owed to a cousin who had been patient enough to wait. Vivienne Sorel was not his mistress. She was his instrument, a poor relation of his own, dressed and coached and paraded at the assembly, for the single purpose of making the county believe a separation was already underway, so that when the settlement was overturned, no one would think it strange. It was Vivienne herself, in the 3rd month of Clara's exile at Larkfield, who first began to understand what she had been made a part of, and did not like it. Percival had promised her a comfortable establishment and a respectable marriage to some cousin of his choosing, once the business was concluded. What he had not told her was that her brother's gaming debts, which Percival had quietly bought up 18 months before, would be called in the moment she showed the slightest reluctance to play her part. She had gone along with the terrace performance believing it a small cruelty in service of a larger, and, she had told herself, harmless deception. She had not understood, until she overheard Percival discussing the forged receipt in plain terms with his solicitor, that the deception was meant to strip a woman of a marriage, a home, and a name, on the strength of a lie about a dead man's honesty. Vivienne Sorel was not a wicked woman. She was a frightened one who had made a bad bargain. And bad bargains, Clara's father used to say, are simply promises made to the wrong creditor. She began, quietly, to keep her own private accounting of what Percival said and did, though she did not yet know what she meant to do with it, or whether she would have the courage to do anything at all. Winter came to Larkfield hard and early that year, and the mill's fortunes came with it, because flour sells dear in a hard winter, and Clara had priced hers fairly enough that the bakeries of 3 villages preferred her to anyone charging more for less honesty. She paid full wages through the frozen weeks, when other mills laid men off, and when Tobias Fenn's mother fell ill and the family could not afford the doctor, Clara paid the bill herself, without being asked, and without mentioning it to anyone, which was how Hetty Marsh came to know about it within 2 days, because nothing travelled faster in Larkfield than a kindness Clara tried to keep quiet. "You'll bankrupt yourself being decent," Hetty told her one evening, not disapprovingly. "I'd rather be decent and poor than idle and comfortable," Clara said. "My father used to say, a ledger is a promise you keep in writing. I mean to keep mine." It was around the fire that same evening, Tobias mending a strap by lamplight, and Hetty darning with the particular concentration of a woman only half listening, that Clara first spoke of Edmund at all since her arrival, not with bitterness, which surprised even her, but with the flat clarity of an audit. "He did not marry me for love," she said, to no one in particular. "I do not think he understood, until recently, that he had come to depend on something more than my usefulness. I do not know that he understands it yet." Hetty did not look up from her darning. "Some men," she said, "need the house to go cold before they notice who kept the fire lit." It was, Clara thought later, the truest thing anyone had said to her in a year. By early spring, the county's opinion of the Duchess of Renwick had turned entirely. The way a tide turns, not all at once, and not because any single wave decided it, but because enough small movements accumulated until the whole shape of the water changed. Merchants who had once addressed their bills to the Duke now addressed them, out of simple practicality, to Mrs. Calloway at the Larkfield Mill, because everyone knew hers were the accounts that got paid on time. Farmers' wives who had once curtsied to her out of obligation now stopped her in the lane to ask her opinion on drainage, on wages, on the fairness of the new corn prices, because they had come to trust that her opinion, once given, would not be walked back. Edmund heard all of this in fragments, at his club in Belhurst, at his own dinner table, in letters from tenants who no longer troubled to conceal that they preferred writing to the Duchess. He had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to find reasons to ride the Larkfield Road, though he never stopped, only slowed his horse near the mill long enough to see the smoke rising steady from its chimney, and the lamps lit in the counting-room window, before riding on. It was Percival who noticed this habit first, and it worried him considerably more than anything Clara herself had yet done, because a duke who began missing his wife was a duke who might, given time and enough humility, go and ask her back before the false receipt could be brought to bear. Percival decided, that spring, that the business could not wait for Edmund to find his courage. It would need to be forced. The forcing came in April, in the form of a letter delivered to Edmund by his own solicitor, informing him with grave regret that a claim had been lodged disputing the validity of his marriage settlement, on the grounds that the dowry recorded as paid in full by the late Josiah Whitfield had, according to a sworn note now in Percival Voss's possession, never actually cleared. The original receipt having been, the solicitor used the word delicately, irregular, Edmund read the letter twice, standing in his own hall, and felt something in his chest go very cold and very still, not for the money, which he could have found elsewhere, but for what the claim implied about the woman he had, for 2 years, allowed himself to think of as merely useful, that she might have come to him on a lie she never knew was a lie, her dying father's last honest act turned, by his own cousin's hand, into a fraud that could unmake her entire life. He did not think, in that moment, of what it would cost the dukedom. He thought of Clara counting out 10 minutes against a case clock, and walking out into the dark with a single trunk, and of how much smaller that 10 minutes now looked beside what she was about to be asked to survive a second time. He rode for Larkfield within the hour, and for the first time in 2 years he did not know what he intended to say when he arrived, only that he could not let her hear it from anyone else first. Clara was in the counting-room when he came, going over the spring wage book by lamplight, and she did not rise when Hetty showed him in, only set down her pen with the same steady, unhurried care she had used to set down her wine-glass 6 months before. "Edmund," she said. "Not your grace. Not a question." He stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands, turning it, and she noted the gesture the way she noted everything, filed it without comment. "There is a claim," he said, "against the settlement, against your father's receipt." He told her, in short unadorned sentences, everything the solicitor's letter had said, and watched her face for the flinch he expected and did not receive. She listened to the whole of it without moving, and when he finished she said only, "Sit down, Edmund. You look as though you might need to." He sat. She reached up and closed her hand around the small brass key at her throat, the gesture entirely unconscious, and for the first time he understood what it was, or thought he did, some sentimental trinket. A lover's keepsake from before their marriage, perhaps, and the thought produced in him a small, unworthy jealousy even in the middle of catastrophe, which told him more about his own feelings than he had managed to admit to himself in 2 years. "That key," he said. "What does it open?" Clara studied him for a long moment, the particular stillness of a woman deciding how much trust a man has earned. "My father's strongbox," she said. "At the old mill counting room. It has been there since before he died." She did not offer it to him. "Not yet." "Then we should go and see what is inside it," Edmund said, "before your cousin decides the county's opinion for both of us." "He is your cousin," Clara said, "not mine. I have not claimed him in some time." It was, though neither of them remarked on it, the first thing approaching a joke either had made to the other in 2 years, and something in Edmund's chest, long locked, moved a fraction of an inch. The strong-box, when they opened it together the following morning, held exactly what Josiah Whitfield's meticulous habits had promised it would hold. 11 years of ledgers in his own careful hand. And, folded inside the cover of the last, a receipt for £3,000 paid in full to the solicitors of the Rennick estate, dated, witnessed, and signed by a name Edmund recognised at once as his own late father's man of business, the same solicitor whose signature appeared, forged, on the fraudulent note Percival now carried. Clara laid the true receipt on the counting-room table beside the wage-book, and looked at it for a long moment before she spoke. "My father told me, before he died, that he had paid every debt he owed in full, in writing, so that no one could ever say otherwise. I did not know until this moment how carefully he meant that." She looked up at Edmund. "He also told me that a ledger is a promise you keep in writing. I have kept mine. I mean to see that this county keeps theirs." Edmund reached across the table, not for the receipt, but for her hand, and stopped himself an inch short of touching it, uncertain, for the first time in his adult life, whether he had earned the right. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "Not tonight, and not with a speech I have rehearsed on the ride here. I mean to give you the whole of it, properly, when there is time to give it its due. But I will say this much now, because I should have said it months ago, and did not have the courage. I called you suitable once, in my own house, where you could hear it, and I let my cousin believe it was the whole truth. It was a lie I told myself before I ever told it to him. You were never merely suitable, Clara. I only lacked the honesty to say so, while I still had the chance to say it privately, instead of publicly, and too late." Clara did not answer him at once. She closed the strong-box, and turned the small brass key in its lock, and set the key down on the table between them, not on its ribbon, not at her throat, but on the table, in the open, where either of them could reach it. "Show me," she said. "Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, the way I have had to show this county what I am worth. Then we will speak of explanations." It was not forgiveness. It was, Edmund understood, something more valuable, terms. What Edmund did not yet know was the full shape of his own coldness, and it was Vivienne Sorel, unexpectedly, who supplied the missing piece within the week, arriving at the mill unannounced and shaking, having finally found the courage her fear had denied her for months. She told Clara everything, the forged receipt, her brother's debts, Percival's threats, sitting in the counting room with her hands wrapped so tightly around a cup of tea that her knuckles had gone white, and when she finished she said, quietly, "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to let me undo it." Clara studied her for a long moment, the particular stillness of a woman deciding whether mercy is a weakness or a weapon, and found, to her own mild surprise, that it was neither. "You will testify," Clara said, "before the whole county if it comes to that, and you will do it because it is true, not because I have asked you to. And your brother's debts," she added, are between your brother and Mr. Voss. They are not the price of your honesty. You may have both. It was the same evening, walking the mill-race path with her father's ledgers under one arm, that Clara finally understood the last piece of Edmund's coldness, which he told her himself 2 days later, plainly, without excuse. His own mother had left Renwick Hall when he was 9 years old, taking with her every portable thing of value, and a great deal that was not portable at all, and had never once written to explain why. His father had spent the rest of his life teaching Edmund, by example and by bitter aside, that love was the one asset a man could never properly secure, and that a wife chosen for competence rather than affection could at least be relied upon not to vanish with the silver. "I did not marry you coldly because I did not value you," Edmund said. "I married you coldly because I had convinced myself that valuing you at all was the one mistake my father never survived making. I was wrong. I have been wrong for 2 years, and afraid to say so, because saying so meant admitting how much there now was to lose." The hearing was held in May in the Assembly Hall at Belhurst, before the county's own bench and half its population besides. Because Percival Voss, confident in his forged note, and unaware that its twin had been sitting in a locked strongbox at Larkfield for 11 years, had pressed his claim to open court rather than let it die quietly. Clara stood before the room in a plain grey gown, not the green silk of a duchess arrayed for battle, and laid her father's true receipt on the clerk's table beside the forged note Percival's solicitor produced, and asked Sir Roland Fenwick, the magistrate, a single precise question, whether the same solicitor's hand could be found to have signed 2 documents, dated the same week, in 2 different inks, aged by 2 entirely different numbers of years. The county's own examining clerk confirmed within minutes that it could not, that the forged note's ink was newer than its stated date by no less than 3 years. The room's murmur turned, the way a tide turns, all at once and irreversibly. Then Tobias Fenn stood, unbidden, from the gallery, and testified that he had heard Percival Voss boast, at the Larkfield Tavern the previous autumn, of a document that would settle Renwick's business for good. And 2 more of Josiah Whitfield's old workers rose after him to say the same. Last of all, Vivienne Sorel stood and told the room, in a voice that shook only at the start and steadied by the end, exactly how she had been made an instrument of the fraud, and exactly what it had cost her to say so aloud. Percival Voss, watching the room's composure, the one thing he had always relied upon in himself, go out like a snuffed candle, offered no defence at all. Sir Roland ordered the false claim dismissed, and the matter referred for further inquiry into the forgery itself. Clara was invited as the wronged party to state what recompense she required of Percival Voss, and the whole hall went silent to hear a woman who had been publicly humiliated on a terrace 8 months before finally given the power to answer for it. "I do not want him ruined," Clara said, and the room, expecting fire, received instead something colder and more exacting. "Ruin is easy, and it teaches nothing. I want the forged note entered into the county record as proof against any future claim of this kind, so that no other family's honest dead can be slandered the way my father's honesty was slandered. And I want Mr. Voss to make full restitution to Miss Sorrel's brother, whose debts he purchased and held as a leash, before this hearing is a week old. It cost her nothing to be merciful, because she had already won everything that mattered. It cost Percival Voss a great deal, because mercy from a position of power is its own kind of sentence, and everyone in the hall understood that she had chosen it deliberately. The explaining came properly at last, back at Renwick Hall a week after the hearing, in the estate office where 2 years of silence had accumulated like dust on the account books Clara had once kept flawless. Edmund gave her this time not an apology alone, but the accounting she had asked for. The whole of his mother's departure, the whole of his father's bitterness. The whole slow architecture of a boy taught that love unguarded was love that would be taken from him, laid out with none of the polish of a rehearsed speech, and all of the difficulty of a man saying a true thing for the first time. An apology says I am sorry for what I did, Clara told him when he had finished. And an explanation says why I did it. And I have learned this past year that a man who offers only the first is asking to be forgiven for a mistake he intends to make again. You have given me the second. I require both, and now I have them. She set her own terms then, without heat, the way she had once set figures in a ledger, because she had learned that terms spoken aloud and terms understood in silence were two entirely different treaties. She required her name restored on every document at Renwick, not as a courtesy but as a partner's signature, equal to his own. She required the Larkfield mill kept open under her authority, hers alone, regardless of what came after between them, because she had built it with her own hands and did not intend to surrender it as a bridal gift back to a marriage that had not yet earned it. She required that whatever came next between them be decided in the daylight, in words, and never again settled by silence at a terrace rail while the county watched and drew its own conclusions. Edmund listened to each condition and answered each the same way. All right, he said to the mill. All right, he said to the ledger. All right to the daylight. When she had finished, he added one more thing of his own, quietly, and I would ask, though it is not mine to require, that you allow me to prove the rest of it, not tonight, and not in a speech, but over time, the way you once asked me to. That is fair, Clara said, and something in the room, long held tense, seemed at last to exhale. Percival Voss made his restitution within the month, stripped of the county's regard and most of his fortune besides, and took a small living offered him, out of a mercy Clara had insisted upon, and Edmund had grudgingly agreed to, at a distant parish where his talent for paperwork could be put to duller and more honest use. Vivienne Sorel's brother's debts were settled, and Vivienne herself, freed of both, accepted a position as companion to Sir Roland Fenwick's elderly aunt in Belhurst, a respectable independence she had never once been offered while under Percival's management, and wrote to Clara that autumn to say, simply, that she had learnt the difference between being useful to someone and being valued by them, and intended never again to mistake the first for the second. The proof, when it came the way proof always did in that house now, not in speeches, but in ordinary days, stacked one upon another until their number could no longer be argued with. It was Edmund moving his own chair, without comment, to sit beside Clara's at the estate desk rather than across from it, so that the ledgers lay open between them and not between him and a wife across a table. It was Edmund learning to pour her tea before she asked for it, and getting the amount of sugar wrong for a fortnight before he got it right, and Clara noting, privately, that the getting it wrong and trying again mattered rather more to her than if he had simply guessed correctly from the start. It was the wage book at Larkfield opened, by his own suggestion, to Renwick's tenants as well, so that no family on either property need wonder again whether they were being dealt with fairly. Nothing in any single gesture would have convinced her of anything at all. It was the accumulation that did it, the way a river is not made by any one drop of rain. There was one slip, in July, that mattered more than all the tea and all the chairs together, because it told her whether the change beneath the gestures was real or merely decorative. A tenant dispute arose over a boundary hedge, the kind of small dry argument that estates absorb by the dozen every year, and Edmund, out of 2 years' worn habit, settled it alone, by letter, without consulting her, the way he had settled everything alone before her. Clara found out only when the tenant thanked her for a decision she had not made. She said nothing that evening until they were alone in the estate office, and then she said, plainly, without heat, "You decided the Hollis boundary without me." That is the old pattern, Edmund, not the new one. He did not argue, and he did not apologize with excess. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you're right. I did it because it was quicker, and because for 2 years quicker was how I did everything that touched this estate. I will write to Hollis tomorrow and tell him the matter is reopened until we have decided it together." He did, the next morning before breakfast, and Clara understood, watching him seal the letter, that the correction mattered more than the original mistake ever could. Because a man who corrected himself without being made to grovel for it was a man who had actually changed the architecture, not merely apologized for the old one. It was on an ordinary evening in September, no anniversary, no assembly, no audience of any kind, that Edmund said the thing he had been building toward all year. In the estate office, with the lamp burning low and the ledgers closed for the night. "I have been thinking about what I said to you once, on the terrace, before any of this began," he said. "That you were suitable, that it was the whole of what I wanted from you." Clara did not look up from the letter she was folding, though her hands had gone still. "I remember," she said. "I would like to say it differently now," Edmund said. "If you will permit me one true sentence instead of a speech. You are not what I bargained for when I married you, Clara. You are what I would beg for, if begging were a thing I still had any pride left to withhold. I would choose you. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some months now, in every small ordinary way I know how, and I intend to go on choosing you for a great deal, longer than either of us has any right to expect." Clara set the letter down, and reached across the desk, and did not take his hand so much as simply let hers rest beside it, near enough to touch. "Then, we are agreed," she said. "We are agreed," he said, and it was, in its way, the whole of the treaty either of them would ever need to sign. 2 years later, in the summer of 1818, the Larkfield Mill still stood open under Clara Calloway's own name on the deed, its wage board still nailed to the door where any passer-by could read it and hold her to it, and beside the counting-room hearth, on a plain iron nail where anyone in the household might reach it, hung a small brass key on a faded blue ribbon, no longer worn hidden at anyone's throat, no longer a secret kept close against a world that might take it, but a fixture of the room itself, open to whoever needed the strong-box, and had honest reason to open it. Tobias Fenn managed the mill's daybooks now, at 19, trusted with a responsibility his own father had never lived to see him hold. Vivienne Sorrel married, that spring, a country clergyman with a small honest living, and wrote to Clara twice a year. Letters that had long since stopped apologizing for anything, because there was nothing left between them requiring apology. Renwick Hall, which had once held its breath the way an old house holds cold in its stones through a whole long winter, had learned, in 2 years, to exhale, its rooms opened, its rents posted fairly, its ledgers kept jointly by 2 names instead of 1, its silences, where they still occurred, comfortable rather than watchful. She had stopped asking to be seen. Not because the asking had ever been unreasonable, but because she had learned, in the space of a single humiliating evening, and the long honest year that followed it, that a person who waits to be valued is a person who has handed someone else the pen. She had taken the pen back. She had built, with her own hands and her father's ledgers, and a key that had once locked a dead man's honesty away from a living man's greed, a life that did not require anyone's permission to be worth living, and a marriage that had finally, belatedly, earned the right to share it. Not because she had forgiven quickly, but because she had required proof before forgiveness. And proof, unlike apology, cannot be spoken in a single evening. Not because love had rescued her, but because she had first rescued herself, and only then allowed love to apply, on her terms, for a place in the house she had rebuilt. She had made herself, in the end, impossible to unsee. And that was not a thing that could ever again be taken from her.